second goal, so thanks everyone for sharing. That was amazing. The second goal, as everyone's aware, was the actual fundraising goal. And that goal was $3,000. And I'm happy to report that we've exceeded this goal. So, yeah, amazing. We're at $3,005 right now.
Woo! Yay!
Yep. And 70 cents. So, yep.
That was
So this means that we will be able to provide 50 free sessions, or for clients who do pay a small fee for their therapy, it means that we will be able to provide upwards to 100 low-cost therapy sessions
yeah.
to those in need. So that's really amazing. So thank you everyone for helping us reach and now exceed the goal. We're also, I'm just wanting to let you know that the registration and donations are still going to be open until October 31st at 11:59 p.m. So Halloween. It's easy to remember. So you can still continue to spread the word, and we can just, you know, sky's the limit right now. Okay, so finally, our third goal was the awareness goal. And Andrew and Lori spoke a little bit about that already. But now I'm going to hand things over to Lori Gill officially. She is the founder of ATTACH Niagara, and she's the creator of the treatment model that's used there. So, Lori, you can take it away.
Okay, so first of all, before we get started, I would like to just thank you, Victoria, for organizing this. Obviously, this wouldn't have happened had you not had the idea and set it up. And yeah, we're incredibly grateful for all of your support, but mostly for Victoria having the idea and bringing it forward and getting things moving, because it really was quite effective, but also something that wasn't very time consuming on our end, which is great because right now we're extremely busy. So I really appreciate that, and we're all really excited with the outcome as well. I also want to acknowledge, and some of you may know this, some of you may not, but Victoria had completed a placement with us where she worked on a capstone project, which was also incredibly instrumental and will continue to be instrumental for us moving forward. And one of the slides that I'll show tonight will highlight some of the work that she did. Basically, what she did was she went through our client database, which is not thoroughly organized at this point, and looked through assessments in a non-identifying manner and started to track client outcomes. So we have a long way to go with making sure that we've got compliance around pre-post outcome measures, but we're certainly headed in the right direction. And for us as an organization to be able to look at the efficacy of the model that we use and the treatment that we do, although we know that it works because we see it with clients, to be able to measure it, to use that to apply for funding and grants and applications, it's an incredible resource. And in fact, we've already used that data to bring forward and raise awareness. So again, I'm really grateful for that, and just that you chose to do placement with us. So that was really wonderful. I have a slide up here that has our social media information. If you're on social media, I'd encourage you to follow us if you're interested in kind of following the work that we do or being trauma informed. We do try to post different resources and knowledge there. And yeah, and then just quickly, the purpose, just for your awareness, of the Attachment and Trauma Treatment Center for Healing Niagara is really working with marginalized, vulnerable populations that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford more of the leading edge trauma treatment. So certainly this type of treatment is often accessible to people who have the funds and means to pay for it, but a lot of the people that really need it don't have the financial means to be able to do that. So this is just about making it accessible regardless of income. And our vision really is being able to continue to provide that quality specialized trauma treatment to meet the unique needs of clients, while also raising awareness in the communities about trauma, how it impacts the brain, body, nervous system. So when Victoria asked about doing a little talk, this is perfect because it helps, again, raise a little bit of awareness. And as kind of we plant seeds and give little nuggets of information, as you pass that on to other people or have discussions, that just broadens awareness, right? And creates a more compassionate or trauma-informed community, which I think is really important. And it aligns with our mission, which is healing life's hurts through awareness, compassion, and self-care. And I think one of the biggest things that we see, even first session with clients, is that when we go through kind of some common trauma reactions and symptoms, that is incredibly validating for a lot of people, because instead of feeling like, oh, what's wrong with me, they start to understand this is what human beings experience. This is how the brain, the body, the nervous system responds following adversity. And that can be very healing in and of itself. So from May 2020 to April 2021, that's our most recent fiscal year, I'm pleased to say that we provided trauma specialized therapy to 248 clients, including 106 new clients. We also provided over 2,778 trauma specialized therapy sessions. So the referrals are continuing to grow at a rate that we can't yet support because we need staffing. So every little bit of funds that we bring in is great. And we've also applied for some grants to see about getting a more permanent position. But why is this important? The majority of the clients, as I mentioned earlier, that we work with don't have means to pay for therapy. The great majority, over 50%, pay $20 or less. And I think over, like 60%, it's $30 or less. So every little bit goes a long way. But when we look at trauma and adversity, I think it's just important to highlight that what we understand is that our brain is rapidly growing in the first years of our life, the earliest years of our life. And many of us know this because there's been a lot of good awareness around this. What a lot of people don't know is that attachment, love, essentially, being picked up, rocked, held, nurtured, is what has the greatest effect on that growth. So 5/6 of our brain's growth and development in those earliest, most critical years is driven by attachment. So whether I'm picked up, rocked, held, nurtured, loved, but it also is the fastest and the biggest period of brain growth and development that we have throughout our entire life. So our brain grows, more than 400% volume wise in that last trimester of pregnancy and into the first year of life. It continues to grow quite rapidly throughout the first few years, but that first year in particular, that last trimester of pregnancy and into the middle of the first year, is the peak of our brain growth and development. What that means, a lot of people think that children are just magically resilient. We now understand that actually it's incredibly vulnerable. And this is why the brain regions that are growing and developing at that time, when we have trauma or adversity, it impairs or inhibits the brain growth and development that's happening at that time. The brain continues to grow and develop from the bottom up and the inside out. But when we have trauma that's happening, that's kind of stunting or impairing that growth and development, it's not growing as optimally as it could be. Okay, this slide here I think is really important to highlight, because research around maltreatment by age shows us that by far the greatest rates of abuse and neglect are 0 to 3 years of age. So mortality as well. So when we're looking at that, what that's showing us is that at the period where our brain is undergoing its most rapid growth and development, where it's most vulnerable and most malleable, is also the rate of increased abuse, right? So when we look at adults later in life and we're wondering, why they're engaging the way that they are, why they're coping the way that they are, quite often it traces back to what has happened to them, what's happened in their life that, has resulted in the adaptations that they have. And it's sad to see, but not surprising to me, that there is so much, unfortunately, abuse and neglect happening early in life. By far, when we look at the type of abuse, it's neglect. So that again is the attachment dysregulation as well, followed by physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological maltreatment, and medical neglect. And when we see medical neglect, that's quite extreme oftentimes, so we see the rest of it usually as well. when we look at this information, it's important not only for understanding the brain development piece, but also understanding later life health outcomes. So what we've learned is that there's a dose response impact on later life health outcomes, not just mental health. So physical health, ischemic heart disease is the leading killer in Canada and the US right now. We have people having heart attacks that are young, that don't have a history of cardiovascular disease. They don't necessarily have symptoms that are leading up to it. But trauma causes our heart to pump harder than it needs to, right? It causes us to be on and activated and mobilizing stored fats. So there's a lot of things that when we look at early life adversity that continue to carry forward into present day that impact things, including cancer, heart disease, COPD, and yes, mental health, addictions, and in other areas of life as well. This is a great visual for kind of capturing the way that all of this comes together. So we have the critical sensitive developmental periods, then you've got your adverse childhood experiences. This is based on the initial ACEs research, which looked at 10 main areas. It's since been expanded because it's not an exhaustive list, but the major categories that the original research looked at was physical, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, mental illness or depression within the home, suicide ideation, incarceration of a family member, substance use in the home, or loss of a parent. Actually, loss of a parent was not on the original study. Divorce and separation was, though, and I don't see that here. And then it also looks at genetics. So genetics research is now showing us that epigenetic factors trace that up to 4 generations, right? We can trace the epigenetics, meaning that the experiences of trauma and resilience can be passed down through our genes to at least 4 generations. Now, that's really significant when we're looking at things like colonization, oppression, mass trauma, war, right? Areas where individuals have certainly experienced trauma, but also it's understanding what's been happening with our ancestors and how might that be impacting us now. And all of this feeds in to impact our brain development at an electrical, chemical, cellular, and mass level, which then impacts our survival-driven adaptations. So how we learn to adapt, connect, relate in the world around us. And then we have, outcomes that come out of that. Not surprisingly, things like the chronic disease, because our body's holding memory of the trauma and it's often stored and stuck in our nervous system. Psychiatric disorders, impaired cognition. Trauma really impacts our ability to pay attention, to learn, to use our skills and strategies. So it impacts school and work, obesity, alcohol, drugs, high-risk behaviors, crime, poverty, and then we've got that intergenerational transmission of trauma and disparity, and certainly suicide as well. So there's a really strong connection when we look at adverse childhood experiences and substance use. I'm not going to go through all of it here, but this is just a quick highlight. So ACEs account for half to 2/3 of all serious substance use. There's a 500% increase in adult alcoholism directly related to early adverse childhood experiences. Nearly 2/3 of injection drug use is attributed to abuse in childhood. 78% of drug injection by women can be attributed to ACEs, and a male child with an ACE score of 6 has a 4,600 increase in the likelihood that he will become an IV drug user later in life. So, I think this is important when we're looking at the population that we work with in particular, where a lot of the things that we see, some people might wonder, well, why is someone behaving this way or why are they doing this? And we look at it and it's like, well, how could they not be to a degree? When we look at their life experiences and the lack of resources that they have available to them and the tools that they do have, a lot of it makes good sense. Part of our work, though, is helping to build in other resources and strategies to help people regulate their nervous system in a way that doesn't involve hurting themselves or hurting others or relying on false refuges that give the illusion that they're helping, but really in the long run are only compounding or building upon what's already there. So we did, as part of the research that Victoria was doing, part of what we did was we looked at client profiles. And when we looked at the adverse childhood experiences, and this is not exhaustive, we got through a lot of files, but there are a lot that we didn't quite get through. So this is a snapshot, I guess, based on new intakes for the 2021-2022 fiscal year. And what we saw is that the majority of the clients that we're supporting have actually a lot of adversity, and that's not surprising to me. Over 15% had an ACE score of 8, 19% had an ACE score of 7, 12% had an ACE score of 6, 5% had an ACE score of 18.6. We do have some who have lower ACE scores, and that's wonderful to see as well. But by far the majority have those higher presentations of adversity, which does have a significant impact on our health outcomes, as I've mentioned. When we broke it down by the type of adversity that was experienced, childhood emotional abuse, almost 80% of individuals experience childhood emotional abuse. This is something that does not get nearly enough attention. As somebody who worked in child welfare and in children's mental health, emotional abuse is incredibly impactful. In fact, it has the greatest impact globally on the brain out of all of the types of abuse, but it gets the least attention quite often. And we have that old adage, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Not true. The research shows us actually that the brain lights up the same way when we are experiencing emotional abuse as it does if we've been physically stabbed. So, you know, the pain centers light up in the same way. Feeling unloved, and that ties in with the emotional abuse certainly as well, but a very, very high prevalence of individuals report feeling unloved. And we've got parents with mental health conditions, neglect, childhood physical abuse, exposure to domestic violence, parental alcohol and drug abuse. All over 50% of our clients had experienced that as part of their childhood. Childhood sexual abuse, nearly 50%. And then parental separation and divorce and incarceration is not, it's got an asterisk there because it's not something we track as a regular part of our intake package, but if it was noted there or people filled it in on their ACE questionnaire, then I added it in. So it's not an accurate representation, but it's certainly something we'll be looking at more closely moving forward. When we look at trauma experiences, so things that people have experienced and adaptations that they've experienced as a result, again, as adults, many people reported, or individuals have reported experiencing emotional abuse, mental illness, physical abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, suicide ideation, close to 50% or over 50%, substance use, miscarriage, and criminal behavior. So this just gives a little bit of a sense of the individuals that we're supporting and some of the things that we're working with. And then this slide comes from the program evaluation that Victoria did, and there were quite a few slides, but this one I think summarizes a lot of the main things that we're working with and is my favorite measure that we use. And this is a trauma symptom inventory. So it looks at subscales as well. And so this just looks at a sample of 51 individuals. And what is the reduction between when they're beginning treatment and when we have the last measure for them? So the last measure may be mid-treatment, it may be towards the end of treatment. But what I'd really like to highlight is we're seeing reductions, particularly the tension reduction behavior has the biggest shift. That's things like self-harm, the substance use, right? The high-risk behaviors, the things people are doing to try to reduce the tension that they're experiencing that may actually be causing harm or risk or threat. Suicidality also went down quite significantly. So really good to be seeing some of these shifts: dissociation, depression, anxiety, intrusive experiences, sexual disturbance, like all of those things are shifting. The area that we see the least change, although there still is change, is around somatic preoccupations. And to me, that makes really good sense. A lot of the clients, when they come in and they start working with us, they're not embodied because it's not been safe to be embodied, right? Their body is a place where there's lots of trauma, turmoil, pain, and it's incredibly uncomfortable to be in the body. As we're reducing the charge that's associated with their experiences by treating the trauma, we're also making it safer for people to be able to be in their body, to feel the feelings and to tolerate those emotions. So as we're kind of working through it, it's not uncommon for people to become more aware than they were when they started treatment about what they're feeling in their body and the discomfort, the tension, the pain, right, that they're experiencing. So, but I anticipate over time this will continue to kind of reduce. So that's a quick little snapshot in a nutshell. The work that we do really helps people to move into experiencing their trauma, moving through it in a safe, structured way, moving through that fear looping process where the brain doesn't consciously in an embodied way seem to understand that that threat has passed. So we're working through it in a safe, structured way. It's a very hard work. Nobody wants to do it. It's not fun, but the healing is possible, and the results really are truly life-changing for people. So I just want to again thank you for your participation. Thank you for coming out tonight and for your support. And I hope that you'll continue to just raise awareness about trauma, mental health, and how your experience of walking or running or engaging in this may have impacted your mood and how you were feeling as well. Because the more that we can kind of spread that awareness, I think the healthier that we are as a community. And community has a pretty far reach, right? So thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions for myself or Victoria.
I have one. I was just wondering, how does people with disability impact how they experience trauma growing up and how they react with change and growth and healing? Have you been able to do anything with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sylvana. So one of the things that I really like about our model is it works well with neurodiverse individuals because it's not a cognitive model. So as a therapist, there are a lot of agencies that I worked at that if somebody had a developmental disability, for example, they could not access services with us because it was more of a cognitive type of therapy. This, because it's sensory based, I've done contracted work with community living organizations and neurodiverse individuals or individuals on the autism spectrum. And because it's sensory, it works quite well. When it comes to the trauma experiences, which I think is the other part of your question, developmental trauma, because it's happening in our formative years, quite often developmental trauma can present as neurodiversity as well. So there are individuals that I've worked with that as a result of the trauma they've experienced, which impacted their brain's growth and development, they were functioning at a level that it was not reflective of their actual competencies. And as we treat the trauma, it's not uncommon that we see that some of that intellectual capacity increases. Sometimes it shifts significantly, sometimes it shifts a bit, but I actually had one experience with an individual I worked with that her intellectual capacity shifted so much that her support said, please don't document that anywhere because she'll lose services, right? Now, it made sense to me because she had tremendous trauma happening during her formative years that really impacted the way that her brain was able to grow and develop. As we were able to depotentiate some of that and really work on building new neural pathways and new neural networks of association, her brain, when it was no longer in that kind of heightened arousal state, had the room to be able to learn and think and experience the world around her differently. Does that make sense?
So does that also mean that if a person as an adult presents sometimes emotionally childlike, that as they get healing, that they might actually get rid of some of that childlike ability?
Yeah, because again, that's often survival driven, right? So in that moment, we talk about the hand brain model quite often and flipping our lid, right? And so when we have big arousal, it causes that higher order, logical, rational part of our brain to go offline. So when we're behaving in that childlike manner, the emotions are kind of taking over, we're flipping our lid, and we're losing access to that logic, rationalization, cause and effect, and strategies that if I were regulated, embodied, grounded, I could look at a situation and respond in a different way. So the more trauma that we've had, quite often, the more quickly that will happen, that we'll flip that lid, right, and lose access process. But as we treat the trauma, what we typically see is more and more we're able to have integration between the body, the nervous system, and the emotions, and that higher order part of our brain. So instead of flipping the lid, I'm able to see, oh, okay, yeah, I noticed there's activation coming up here. I get it. I get where this comes from. That was needed then. It's not needed to the same degree now. Now I'm going to instead use my ocean breathing or relaxation place or some of the skills that I've learned or the breathing just to help me shift through this. And we're keeping that higher order part of the brain online. Yeah. And the more we practice that, the more readily that comes available to us. But it's not magic, right? And especially the longer that this stuff has been happening for us and that these have been our reflexive responses, the more time and practice and energy and intentionality and conscious awareness it takes to shift it. So with little kids, when we're doing this work preventatively and there's been trauma, and not preventatively would be great. But when we're doing this work with little kids following a trauma, their little brains form new neurons and neural pathways so fast, right? And if we could correct something or help heal through the trauma of something, that's incredibly helpful. When we have years and years and years of certain thought patterns and responses being reinforced, and we want to change that, sometimes I can almost see what looks like that tug of war happening in clients' brains, where, you know, we're trying to create a new neural network of association, and they have this stuff that's hardwired from a survival perspective. And you can actually see the brain kind of like being like, oh, I don't know if that's okay. Oh, but yeah, that is. I know now this is. And it's like there's this tug of war that's happening because, you know, they've learned that they needed to believe something different for survival. Yeah. Cool. Great questions. Any other questions? All right, you're awful quiet. I hope that wasn't too neuro-based, but the brain is pretty fascinating.
Great. Thanks, Lori. Oh, sorry. Was someone talking?
I was just saying that was very interesting.
It's fascinating.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so too, but I'm biased. So
for hours. It's amazing.
I don't have a specific question, but it would be cool to hear more neuroscience jargon.
Yeah. So there's a lot of talks on our YouTube channel that break down the neuro a little bit more. And if you're interested in listening more, I'd encourage you to check that out just because there are quite a few, and especially through the pandemic, I did a lot of kind of talks or guest speaking things where I expanded on some of this from a parenting perspective or just wellness perspective. But if you have questions, ask. Andrew, I'm always happy to talk about the brain because I find it incredibly fascinating as well. So
I have a question. I have to run out for the first few minutes probably of Victoria's presentation. What is the age range of your clients?
Great question. So we work with all ages, actually. The highest percentage tends to be early adulthood and adults, so 20, 30, 40. But I think the youngest we've worked with is prenatal. And we work certainly with infants and young children when there have been traumas as well, supporting their parents, helping them to help their little brains form meaning, because the brain, even though it's pre-verbal, the brain, body, and nervous system hold memory of trauma. So things like medical trauma, even cesarean section. I didn't know that at the time, but that's a trauma. The body is not going through the natural birthing process, so it has a different impact. So there are things that we can do to help the brain form meaning of the perceived threat that happened during those experiences in a pretty quick and easy way. The most senior person I've worked with, I think, was in their 90s. So, okay. And some people will say, oh, I had somebody actually say this to me, another trauma therapist. They said, well, you know, they're 90. This is the way they've experienced life. It's not going to change now. And I said, I respectfully disagree. right? We see this all the time. So just because this is what somebody's been, living with for 90 years doesn't mean that it can't shift. It may be slower, it may be hard work. Um, Sometimes actually that's really fast change because it's just that they've never done that work or had the opportunity.
And just one more question, because when I looked at the, I get was not the Venn diagram, but the diagram with such a large percentage related to neglect, I just wondered what the Niagara community, how they address that, because I mean, we're talking, there's a huge role for preventive work as opposed to, I mean, the therapy is certainly necessary, but is there a partner organization or how the region sort of deals with this kind of percentage of of issues that don't have to happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think prevention is always the goal, right? And anytime we have early childhood or any preschool based resources involved in our trainings, I'm always so excited. Off the top of my head, I would say Niagara Region does a lot of stuff. We've got the Healthy Babies program, so through Niagara Region Public Health. We don't have, and maybe that will change. So as an organization, I will say we're new, we're a nonprofit. We've just recently gotten charitable status. All of those things kind of impact. We have charitable status as we get government funding. All of that leads to greater credibility of our organization, which leads to partnerships, right? And being invited to sit in on different community tables and discuss awareness goals and objectives, and then kind of partner with organizations. So hopefully, we're only 2 years old
Yeah.
as an organization. So hopefully, as we build more community partnerships and build more awareness, we'll be able to collaborate more with agencies that are doing this type of work, but also um, raise awareness, I think, about the impacts of trauma and attachment, because I don't think it's quite where it should be. It's growing. It's definitely growing. But we have organizations here like Strive, for example, that we've done a lot of work with. Strive is a fabulous program that works with high-risk young moms. And they're fully trained and certified in our trauma-informed approach. Bethlehem Place is another wonderful place that has supportive housing and builds in caregiver support and awareness. So there are some really excellent programs that we have here, but I think the missing piece when I hear people talking about the early years is just what you've said. It's the attachment piece. And I don't think most people get how critical it is. Love literally grows our brain. And when we don't have it, there's an old idea of you have a roof over your head, you have clothes, you have water, you have everything you need. That's not true, right? 5/6 of that brain growth and development in that first year is driven by attachment. So, we can survive, but we're not growing as optimally as we can.
But also the fact that you are healing individuals who are youngish, like in the younger age, basically that can be preventive for future generations. So if a person who is having problems, if they can start feeling good about themselves and understand the needs, then maybe their children or their whatever kind of relationships they're in will be more healthy. So, it's all sort of part and parcel. So
Yeah, and that's, thank you for saying that, because again, when we look at the intergenerational research, the research is showing us that if we can treat the trauma before people have children, even in utero, it can actually impact that intergenerational transmission of trauma. So when we were talking about that intergenerational transmission of trauma being passed down 4 generations, if we can
right.
actually treat the trauma, rebalance the nervous system, right, it changes the way that that's passed down. And instead, what's being passed on more so is that resilience rather than the threat response. So huge. So from a preventative perspective, that's, I think, incredible.
I have another question. I was just wondering, how do you determine and decide, with taking into consideration all the different issues that people present when they come to you, how long journey that you allow people to have? Like,
Yeah.
do they get healed? Do they get partially healed? How does it work?
Yeah, great question. So we are not at this time government funded, right? Which is the trickier piece. All of the therapy that we've done so far has been completely in kind. A lot of student hours, a lot of volunteer hours, and fundraising in the community, which has been really helpful. But I'll say this is probably our biggest fundraising event that we've had. So just put that in perspective. $3,000, it's, maybe not a lot of money to a lot of government funded organizations. To us, it's huge, and is more than any one event that we've had in the past. So we're working with a very small amount of money and a very high demand. We have a very high waiting list. So I think when we last checked, there were over 100 people on our waiting list for treatment. It continues to increase. The majority of the clients on our wait list experience suicide ideation. So there's a risk factor there as well. So we don't have a set in stone number of sessions, but originally our average was about 10 to 15 sessions. With the pandemic, it increased. So I think, Victoria, when you averaged out the sessions, it worked out to 22 or 23 sessions per person. We have certainly, wouldn't turn somebody away who still needed the service, but we're also more acute. So if we're working with somebody and they've worked through the trauma and really what they need now is life skills, day-to-day support, ongoing counseling, that's when we would be referring out, because that somebody else can do that stuff. We are really looking at treating those big trauma experiences that are really making it hard for people to function and cope on a day-to-day. And we're trying to work through those so that we can allow somebody else that also needs, that bigger stuff to be worked through. So there's space to provide that support. And that's where we're referring back to other community-based organizations that are really good at doing the day-to-day therapy piece, but don't necessarily have the tools to do the more complex trauma treatment piece. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I have a follow-up thought. I was wondering, you wouldn't leave somebody midstream or part stream if they're still in a bad way or anything like that, right?
Right. Yeah. So, and again, if it's trauma specific that they're needing, absolutely. And we try to be flexible and work around that. But we also are not a long-term counseling. So some people, for example, will do counseling for years. That's not our model. Our model is more kind of getting in there and treating the underlying issues. So sometimes people enjoy therapy, they find it helpful. That's really wonderful. Some people would stay with us for a really long time if that was an option. But because we're not government funded and there is a high demand, that makes it a little bit trickier, where we have to kind of balance that more acute need with the wait list as well. And that's hard, but it's a reality. So that's where donations like this, though, and events like this really do make a substantial difference. Yeah. And everything's case by case, because we do have some clients that need like 30, 40 sessions and some clients that need 3, right? So, or 2. That's not the majority of the clients that we serve. On average, it is the 22 or 23 sessions, but everybody's different. So, each case is evaluated on that case by case basis. Great.
All right. Great.
Things back to
Thank you,
you, Katie.
everyone, for attending. And thanks so much, Lori. That was great.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Thank you, Lori and Victoria.
Yes. And again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Victoria, for getting this going. It was a great idea and very successful, which we're really excited about as well.